In last week's episode, the Minister of Transport and Communications, Nonofo Molefi, drove home the need for all stakeholders to play their part in the promotion of science and technology in Botswana.
This will take an effort on the part of all stakeholders, the political leadership, civil society organizations, and business, to demonstrate to the public the possible benefits associated with deployment of ICT services.
Tonight we witness how the Botswana International University of Science and Technology is exemplifying this very sentiment, engaging the media to help them make science and technology developments more accessible to all. Some leading science commentators have called upon journalists on the African continent, saddled with the onerous task of disseminating information to enhance public awareness on the relevance of science, technology, and innovation, to adopt innovative approaches in their reporting for the continent's socio-economic development. They argue that sustainable development in Africa has to be science-led, driven by the unprecedented transfer of technology and the acquisition of knowledge. They say that the media could set the agenda for every technology to lead to an innovation and for every innovation to lead to a product. With, among others, this goal in mind, recently the Botswana International University of Science and Technology hosted a media workshop in Gaborone. Speaking at the occasion, the Vice-Chancellor of BUST, Professor Hilary Inyang, said they are going to rely on their partnerships with the media to disseminate the important work the university will be doing. In our program this evening, we interrogate the ways in which the media can make science sexy for everyone. And our guests are the Vice-Chancellor of the Botswana International University of Science and Technology, Professor Hilary Inyang, as well as the President of the South African Science Journalists Association, Mandy Smallhorn. Welcome to First Issues. Welcome back to First Issues, as tonight we discuss ways in which to write factual but juicy science and technology stories in a bid to promote their consumption. As we conclude the show, we look at solutions to common problem areas faced in the writing of these stories. Many journalists are reported to be afraid of reporting on science and technology. They think the subjects are either too complicated for them to understand or too boring for their audience. This does not have to be so. With proper preparation and an understanding of the rules, reporting on science and technology developments can be one of the most interesting jobs a journalist can have. Joining us this evening is the Vice-Chancellor of BUST, Professor Hilary Inyang. Professor, let's start with the basics. What is the difference between science and technology?
Science seeks the fundamental truth in the nature of the universe, while technology has to do with taking those fundamentals and creating processes and instruments for doing things that have been made possible by that knowledge that comes from science.
You have been quoted as saying or implying that science and technology has always been a part of our existence, and even with news. But our ancestors may have not necessarily used those particular terms to describe such disciplines. Could you please elaborate?
What science is doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be nouveau science. Science has always been there. It may not have been formalized as science. As I said earlier, some time ago, it needs, human development itself, from having clothing, from shelter, and some of the basic necessities of life would not have been possible without science. You may not have had well laid out procedures for doing things, but it was implied. Today you know that if you go to Kansi, you go to some of the districts of Botswana, you see that people have been doing some things in the customary way. They know that if you get sick, you should take this particular leaf, squeeze it, use it. They may not know the stoichiometry of chemistry. They may not know what concentrations would make that work. But they have a sense of it, even the native doctors. That is science. It has not been formalized yet, so our challenge now is to find ways of formalizing those kinds of principles and describe them using modern lingua franca, modern linkers, molecules, atoms, concentrations, all of those, so that we can share the same market and attribute to them that intellectual property, because there is some sense and there's some process for doing that. So science has always been there, and I've said many times before, it takes as much ingenuity, scientific ingenuity, for the Bushmen to have survived in a very harsh climate in the Kalahari for thousands and thousands of years, as it has taken the Norwegians to survive in the cold in the northern parts of this world. So science and technology have been things that have been inseparable from our human experience.
As a journalist, how does one build up knowledge of such a huge and diverse field, with every sector having basic principles that govern it?
There are two interactive approaches for doing that, and both are necessary for somebody to be a good science journalist. The first one is that the journalist has to know about the basic principles of science, fundamentals of evidence, that you need data to prove something, and that a lot of times in science we cannot speak with absoluteness. So there is a level of probability. When we say, okay, it will rain tomorrow, it might rain tomorrow. The probability that it's going to rain tomorrow might be very high. But there's always a chance that something that we think about is not completely correct, you see. So in the legal profession, where they may ask you a yes or no answer, in science, yes or no answers are very rare. So we talk in terms of probability. I can tell you, well, California has the probability that there will be an earthquake that will happen next year of a certain magnitude, 7.5. That's only a probability. So there is a chance that it might not happen. Certainties are very rare. If certainties were the norm, then there would be no need to investigate something. So we know that there's a limited amount of knowledge we have, and anytime we discover things, we discover there is more to be discovered. And this is not something that is bad, because the world has advanced through that system. Second, so journalists have to know about those basic principles. In addition to that, they have to pick a few sectors of knowledge for deepening of their experience and information. For example, we might have somebody after that basic knowledge of the principles of science say, I want to be a science journalist, I want to be an energy journalist, I want to be an health journalist, I want to be a transportation journalist. So there's got to be some level of specialization that can help inform our people. The role of journalists is very important. For example, supposing the parliament wants to vote on an issue, parliamentarians are politicians, they will listen to what the bent of the people in society is, what the people want. After all, in a democracy, it's representation, right? You have to take into consideration the thinking of the people, the general citizenry. How is the general citizenry going to be postured in the right way if they don't have the information? If you take Ebola, for example, or you take any other thing that has happened, our interest in renewable energy, we must have an informed public. And journalists can do a good job of making sure that there is diffusion of scientific knowledge throughout society. So you have to deepen your own knowledge before you inform the rest of society.
What is the challenge of reporting on science issues and matters to the public?
The challenge in reporting science to the public is that the rate at which science breaks, something that was true yesterday may be dramatically different from today. So the scientist or the science journalist himself or herself has to be up to date and breaking science. Also, there is the issue of conclusions that are based on data, right? You may have a set of data say this is true, and then the other one says that is not true. How does the science journalist establish the balance between opposing points of view. Science is not absolute, I keep saying. Some people will have a point of view that is different, and some others will have a point of view that is different. So they tend to be opposite. What does the journalist tell society? So the journalist has to be balanced in the reporting to say some people say this, some people say this, but politicians and the general public, to put that within the context of public policy, they have to reach the best case, the optimal combination of things that they should do based on that information. It is never maximal. So you are always going to find some critique that, well, the other person said that. But what we do in science to convert science to public policy is what is the weight of evidence.
Is the time not right for scientists to consider taking a reader-friendly approach in writing their articles and get rid of the jargon, academic writing, and maths?
Yes, unfortunately, science like law has a tradition. You may ask me, why do people wear academic gowns at graduation? Choristers wear their gowns, and academic people wear that. So there is that sense of tradition. Beyond that, those jargons enable us to speak the same language. You say, you can have Russian scientists. For Russian scientists, molecules will be molecules. For American scientists, African scientists, molecules will be molecules. So when you say molecules, we know what that means. Now, it is very difficult in some regards to change some of those things. Some aspects of science, by their very nature, have a lot of complexity. Oversimplification is impossible. How can we simplify quantum mechanics? That's a very complicated field. So the best thing that can be done is to seek for language that can be used to explain it without changing it, because there are some fundamental principles that are embedded in it, and they are all driven by configuration of equations and rules about those equations. Those rules are very, very rigid, and violation of them will render the theory irrelevant and incorrect. So with respect to communicating what those are, then we should temper scientific jargon with everyday usage language. That is where the journalists come in. That is where the trained communicators come in. Not every scientist is a good communicator. Let me say this. They may be very deep in their fields, but they may not know how to communicate to the uninitiated. So we hope that with these initiatives we're starting with communication of scientific knowledge, it will be possible to find some very good people who can communicate with the public, communicate discoveries, because we need that. Remember that even the budget that is used to do science is provided in most regards by society. If they do not understand the utility of that, they will say the budget should be cut because they see no relevance. But the establishment of relevance is something that is aided by communication ability.
Do you appreciate the peculiar position that journalists, especially in Africa, find themselves in, where they are less empowered to report on matters of science and technology, yet there is such importance and such a need for them to foster innovation and development by reporting on such matters?
Yes, this is the biggest disappointment with respect to science in Africa. The lack of interest in discoveries and all of that, but they focus almost exclusively on politics. This needs to change before African countries can rise to compete with, for example, Southeast Asian countries. If you pick a Southeast Asian newspaper, you see a whole lot of things on science and tech discoveries, setting up of industry, debates on approaches in industry and all of that. But that pales in importance in Africa relative to political news. Political news dominates the headlines, the first page, and we would like more scientists to come out and propose things in the newspapers on television, or even things that are not exclusively in the scientific sector, but somehow a hybrid of sectors. For example, why are we not debating the role of science and religion in lives in Africa? That is very important.
We are now joined by Mandy Smallhorn, a South African science journalist, editor, author, and columnist, to discuss further how the media can make science sexy for everyone. Mandy was the coordinator of the day's events at the Boost Science Journalism Workshop at the GICC. We assume that gathering news for a science piece is much like a general news piece. But what elements should a journalist really focus on when reporting on matters of science and technology?
The credibility of the science is key. Far too often people get sent a press release by an institution about something they consider to be really exciting, a breakthrough. But if you look at it, it's a small study, it's not likely to be replicated, it's not credible. So as a science journalist, you need to be able to interrogate the science behind a claim.
Many scientists simply do not trust journalists.
With good reason. And that's one of the reasons is because they tell you maybe, possibly, it could be, but more work needs to be done. And you go and you put a headline that says, eggs will kill you. And that does not reflect what their science is actually saying. That's the first thing. The second thing is that journalists don't really trust scientists. So they tend to be suspicious of their motives, and very often I have seen scientists who have been really badly mauled by the media. So that frightens them. They're not people necessarily, you know, and they don't like being out there. So yeah, there's a reason for it. And we need to manage it.
How do we?
Understanding who scientists are, what their motives are, and understanding that they are just normal human beings. You know, one of the golden rules of journalism is you never let your source see what you wrote, what quotes you used. You know that golden rule? I break that rule all the time. I say to the scientist, whatever I quote you on, you will see before it goes to print, because you're talking about ellipses and minerals and things like that, and how can I possibly fully understand it? I want it to be accurate too. And that builds a level of trust between me and the scientist.
Which other ways can the relationship be made more sustainable? How can journalists engender trusts from scientists?
I think being transparent about your own motives as well, what you need from them. With climate change, there hasn't been a lot of that, and now scientists are beginning to see that their natural caution, coupled with the journalists' tendency to say, well, it's got to be two sides to this, you know, equal sides, has led to a false portrayal of what the picture really is. The consensus is about 98% that we have climate change already and that it is man-made. That hasn't been portrayed in the media. So the media need maybe to talk to the climate change scientists and say to them, we need more definite information from you. We need statements that we can put out there, as in, you know, eggs will kill you, the climate will kill you, something more strong from you. We don't want more of this qualification. Being more transparent about what we want, what we need, what's going to sell newspapers and radio shows.
At heart, scientists and journalists do the same thing. They tell stories about the world around them, how the universe works, how systems develop over time, and about how people interact. From points of fact or data, they extrapolate narratives and meaning. But while journalists are conditioned to write for the person on the street, scientists often write for a very specific community and end up placing this world of wonder and all its stories out of reach of the average person.
I agree completely, and it is happening. There are a lot of scientists out there who are blogging and writing for newspapers and that sort of thing. But one has to remember that some of the most brilliant scientists just aren't articulate people. They're never going to be. And that's why they actually need an interface between them and the public. And journalists should be playing their part at being that interface.
Where do you think scientific journalism is at, especially in Africa?
This is a passion of mine. I think that we are fairly unsupported. There are a number of African Science Journalist Associations, but a lot of them are relatively small. A lot of the journalists in them are also writing general stuff. There's no specific focus on scientific journalism or science journalism in Africa. We are looking to put together an African Science Journalists Conference with the support of our brethren in Africa. In the next year, we're putting together a bid for the World Federation of Science Journalists Conference to come here to Africa in 3 years' time. We want to create a network across Africa, a grassroots means for us as science journalists to communicate with each other, because you're very often quite alone when you're writing this kind of stuff. To be able to just tap into, say, a Google forum and say, hey guys, have you ever written about such and such? Who can I talk to? Am I taking the right angle? Is this responsible? Would be so helpful, I think. And those three things are passions of mine. I want to see us in Africa supporting each other and being comrades in the cause of science journalism.
As we part ways this evening, it would do us all well to internalize the sentiments put forth by Mandy Smallhorn that it is now Africa's turn to host as well as drive debates on science and technologies. And to better appreciate the invaluable role put forth by Professor Hilary Inyang that both journalists and other content producers have to play in banishing the idea that science and innovation is the forte of nations other than our own. From me, Namitso Sibina, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, we wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.